A ranch dog named Shep dropped something on the porch in the middle of the night in 1981 on a ranch near Meeteetse, Wyoming. And what he'd been playing with turned out to be an animal science had already given up for extinct. Nobody expected that discovery to eventually rewrite what we thought we knew about a completely different animal, one that lives in millions of homes right now and still carries a genetic mystery nobody has solved. We call it the ferret. For nearly 2,000 years, the true story of where it came from went unrecorded because nobody thought a small, fast, nocturnal animal moving through the walls of a Roman granary was worth writing down. We assumed we knew the outline anyway. A small hunting animal tamed somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, carried across Europe by soldiers and traders, used for one purpose above all others: chasing rabbits out of their burrows and into human hands. We were wrong about almost all of it. The deeper we look into the genetic and archaeological record of this animal, the less it resembles the tidy story most people carry around in their heads. We do not know, with certainty, which wild species it came from. We do not know exactly when. We do not know exactly where. And the animal we call domesticated today may be far stranger and far more recently settled into that role than almost any other creature living beside us. This is what the evidence actually shows. Let's begin. For most of the last century, the ferret's origin story was treated as a minor footnote to a bigger and more glamorous history: the domestication of the cat. The two animals share a superficial resemblance in the role they played. Both were small predators, both were adopted by agricultural societies to control the animals that threatened stored food, and both eventually became household companions. Because the cat's story had been worked out in reasonable detail, tracing back to Near Eastern wildcats and Egyptian veneration, many assumed the ferret story would follow a similarly clean arc. Tame the wild ancestor somewhere convenient, spread it along trade routes, done. The textbook version, where one existed at all, usually placed ferret domestication somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, possibly North Africa, sometime in antiquity, with the animal then carried into Europe by the expanding reach of Roman and later Norman power. The evidence for this came from scattered written sources rather than bones. Classical authors mention animals used for hunting rabbits out of burrows, a practice called ferreting, that required an animal small and slender enough to enter a warren and either kill or flush out the occupants without simply eating them on the spot. A Roman-era text describes something very like a ferret being used for exactly this purpose. Later, early medieval writings from around the 6th century mentioned similar animals being used to hunt rabbits. Each theory had its evidence. The written record was consistent enough, spanning centuries and multiple regions, to suggest that whatever this animal was, it had been doing this specific job for a very long time. But the written record had a serious limitation baked into it from the start. Words like the Latin and Old French terms used in these texts do not map cleanly onto a single modern species. A writer describing a small animal used to hunt rabbits could have been describing a ferret, a polecat, or something in between. And ancient authors were not zoologists working from a modern taxonomic key. The methodological flaw sitting underneath the entire consensus was this: historians and early naturalists were reading 2,000-year-old words and assuming they knew exactly which animal those words referred to, without any biological evidence to confirm it. The corral fences and milk residues that anchored horse and cattle domestication stories had no equivalent here. There was no chemical signature, no distinctive tooth wear, nothing written directly into bone. There was only language. And language is slippery. The other problem was almost physical. Ferrets are small. Their skeletons are delicate, easily crushed, easily scattered, easily lost in the churn of centuries of soil. Archaeologists digging through a site layered with the bones of cattle, sheep, and pigs are far less likely to notice or carefully preserve the tiny, fragile bones of a mustelid than they are to catalog the femur of an ox. For decades, this meant the physical evidence for ferret domestication was thin. not necessarily because ferrets weren't there, but because almost nobody was looking closely enough to find them, or because what they found had already crumbled past recognition. So the consensus that formed was really a consensus built on absence. In the absence of firm skeletal evidence, in the absence of any genetic data at all, in the absence of anything resembling the study that pinned down the origins of the horse or the dog, historians and zoologists filled the gap with the most plausible reading of ancient text and repeated it until it hardened into something that sounded like settled fact. It was never settled. It was a placeholder, waiting for a kind of evidence that, until recently, nobody had the tools to gather. Unlike the dog, the horse, the chicken, or the cat, the ferret has never been the subject of a single, sweeping, landmark ancient DNA paper with hundreds of ancient genomes laid side by side. No team has yet done for the ferret what Anders Bergstrom's team did for the dog at the Francis Crick Institute, or what Ludovic Orlando's team did for the horse at the Center for Anthropobiology and Genomics in Toulouse. That absence is itself part of this story, and it tells you something about how genetics has approached the tree of domesticated animals. Unevenly, chasing the biggest, most economically significant species first, and leaving smaller, stranger animals, like the ferret, for later. What does exist is a body of comparative genetic and morphological work, built up gradually rather than in one decisive publication, that has done to the ferret what ancient DNA did to the dog and the horse in miniature. It took a story that had calcified into fact and reopened it. Researchers working across skull morphology, coat genetics, and behavioral comparison have spent years trying to answer a question that sounds almost embarrassingly basic for an animal humans have lived alongside for centuries. Which wild polecat is the domestic ferret actually descended from? 3 candidate species sit in the frame: the European polecat, the steppe polecat, and the Mediterranean, or European, polecat's close relative found across parts of North Africa and southern Europe. Comparative studies of skull shape and coat coloration have repeatedly pointed toward the Mediterranean lineage as the closest match, but the picture has never fully resolved into certainty the way it has for cats or dogs. The headline finding, if it can be called that, is not a single triumphant reveal. It is an uncomfortable admission that is held steady across multiple lines of evidence. We still do not have a confirmed wild ancestor population for one of the oldest working animals in European history. Skull shape alone has proven to be a treacherous guide here, in a way that has tripped up more than one research team. Polecats and ferrets interbreed readily wherever their ranges overlap, and hybrid populations across parts of Britain and continental Europe carry skull and jaw proportions that sit in a blurred middle ground between wild and domestic form. A skull recovered from a dig site cannot always be sorted cleanly into one category or the other, because the animal it came from may genuinely have been both, the offspring of a domestic ferret that escaped captivity and bred with a wild polecat living nearby. Feral ferret populations have existed in places like New Zealand and parts of Britain for centuries, descended from escaped or released animals, and their skeletons complicate any simple before and after picture of domestication. This is a problem the horse and dog research never had to fully contend with. In the same way, since wild aurochs and wolves were not routinely breeding back into managed herds and kennels across the exact centuries researchers were trying to study. But here is where the story becomes strange. If you follow the animal itself, rather than the words used to describe it, a different kind of evidence appears. Evidence written not in bone, but in ecology. Wherever ferrets show up with any reliability in the historical and archaeological record, rabbits show up first. The European rabbit, the direct ancestor of every pet rabbit alive today, did not originate across the whole of Europe. It evolved and remained largely confined to the Iberian Peninsula, the region we now call Spain and Portugal, for an extraordinarily long stretch of its evolutionary history. Rabbits were raised in captivity there for at least 2,000 years before they were deliberately carried north and released into new territory. As Roman and later medieval elites spread rabbits into England, France, and beyond, stocking warrens for hunting and for meat, they created something that had not existed in most of Europe before: dense, artificial, human-managed rabbit populations concentrated in one place. And once that resource existed, the animal that could exploit it followed. This is where the single origin question gets genuinely interesting, because it mirrors something researchers have now confirmed happened independently with an entirely different species. The domestic cat did not spread into Europe primarily because farmers went out and captured wildcats one by one. It spread because grain stores drew rodents, rodents drew wildcats, and the boldest of those wildcats tolerated human proximity long enough to become a fixture of agricultural life. The chicken followed an almost identical pattern in Southeast Asia, drawn out of the forest by fallen rice rather than captured and caged. The evidence for the ferret points toward the same mechanism, but inverted in a small and telling way. Rather than the wild predator being drawn toward a food source that already followed humans, in this case, humans appear to have manufactured the food source first by transplanting rabbits far outside their native range. And only then does the ferret's presence in the written and physical record become dense and consistent. The animal did not domesticate itself around an accident of agriculture. It seems instead to have been deliberately bred, and kept specifically because humans had already built an artificial abundance of prey and needed a tool precise enough to exploit it without destroying it. Read that again. Most domestication stories on this channel describe an animal drawn toward humans by a resource humans created by accident, grain spilling from a threshing floor, rice fallen in a paddy field. The ferret story runs the opposite direction. Humans appear to have engineered the resource, the rabbit warren, first, and then selected an animal specifically suited to work inside it. If that reading holds, the ferret may be one of the only domesticated animals in the historical record whose relationship with humans began not as an accident of proximity, but as a targeted solution to a problem people had created for themselves. We do not have a single-name study with a clean date attached to confirm this sequence the way we do for horses or chickens. The evidence is circumstantial, built from the overlapping timelines of rabbit translocation and ferret textual appearance, rather than from a single, decisive genome. The DNA cannot tell us with certainty which came first in every region. It can only tell us that everywhere ferrets appear reliably in the record, managed rabbit populations appear alongside them, and that pattern repeats too consistently across too many centuries to be coincidence. There is a behavioral clue tangled up in this ecological story that deserves its own moment, because it separates the ferret from almost every other animal on this channel. Domestication usually softens an animal's relationship with a single prey species into something closer to indifference. A dog no longer needs to hunt to eat. A cat kept as a companion may never chase anything but a toy. The ferret is different. Its entire usefulness to humans depended on keeping its predatory drive toward rabbits fully intact, while somehow also making the animal safe enough to be handled, carried in a coat pocket, and trusted not to simply kill everything it caught underground. That is a strange, narrow kind of selection, breeding for tameness toward the handler while preserving, almost surgically, aggression toward one specific other species. Few domesticated animals show that split as sharply as the ferret does, and it may explain why domestic ferrets today still exhibit hunting behaviors: the low predatory crouch, the sideways hop, the instinct to cache food that most other household animals lost generations ago. And here, the story becomes darker, in a way that connects the ferret to a genuinely disturbing chapter of more recent conservation history, one that most people who own a pet ferret today have never heard. The domestic ferret has a wild North American cousin, not an ancestor, but a cousin, called the black-footed ferret. It is a distinct species, native to the prairies of the American West, that evolved independently of the Old World polecats and has existed on that continent for roughly 30,000 years, living almost entirely off a single prey species, the prairie dog. When European colonization reached the American plains, colonists brought with them not just cattle and fences, but disease and a deliberate campaign to eliminate prairie dogs, which were seen as competitors for grazing land. Poisoning programs across the 20th century devastated prairie dog colonies across millions of acres. Because the black-footed ferret depended on prairie dogs for both food and shelter, using their abandoned burrows to live in, the collapse of the prey species dragged the predator down with it. By the late 20th century, the black-footed ferret was believed to be extinct in the wild. Then, in 1981, on a ranch near the small town of Meeteetse, Wyoming, a ranch dog named Shep brought his owners something he had been playing with in the night. It turned out to be a black-footed ferret, an animal thought to no longer exist anywhere on the continent. That single accidental discovery led to an emergency effort to trap the last surviving individuals and begin a captive breeding program, one of the most extreme rescues in the history of American wildlife conservation. Every black-footed ferret alive today descends from a founding population of just 18 animals, 7 of which never reproduced. A genetic bottleneck so severe that the species remains critically endangered and dependent on ongoing human intervention, including in recent years cloning experiments intended to reintroduce genetic diversity lost decades ago. This is not the domestic ferret's own ancestral lineage, but it stands as a warning written in the same family tree, a reminder of how easily an entire branch of mustelid history can be erased within a single human lifetime, and how much of what survives today does so only because of chance, a dog's curiosity, and a narrow window before the last individuals were gone for good. The uncertainty around the domestic ferret's own deep origins connects to this same fragility. Because ferret bones are so small and so poorly represented in the archaeological record, we may have already lost the physical evidence that would let us pin down exactly when and where domestication occurred. Unlike the horse, where hundreds of ancient genomes could be gathered and compared across a continent, or the dog, where 72 ancient genomes spanning 11,000 years could be sequenced and cross-referenced, the ferret has left behind a far thinner trail. Some researchers suspect this is not because ferrets were rare in the ancient world, but because archaeologists digging through refuse layers for centuries simply were not looking for something so small. And where they did find fragments, they may not have recognized them as significant enough to preserve and record. An entire chapter of this animal's history may be sitting unread in museum drawers and unpublished excavation notes, mislabeled or unexamined, waiting for the kind of careful reanalysis that finally corrected the record for chickens, when researchers went back through decades of misidentified and badly dated bones and stripped away thousands of years of assumed history that simply did not hold up under direct testing. Nobody has yet done that systematic reanalysis for the ferret. When someone finally does, the story told here today may itself be overturned again. There is a genetic mechanism at work in ferrets that mirrors something seen across other domesticated mustelids and carnivores more broadly, and it offers a second kind of evidence, even without a landmark ancient genome study to anchor it. Domestic ferrets today show a strikingly wide range of coat colors and patterns compared to their wild polecat relatives, from the classic dark-masked sable coloring that closely resembles wild polecats, to albino white, to cinnamon, to elaborate mixed patterns that do not occur naturally in any wild population. This kind of runaway variation in coat color, unlinked to any survival advantage in the wild, is one of the most consistent genetic fingerprints of domestication across species. It shows up in dogs, in cats, in horses, in foxes bred experimentally for tameness in captivity, most famously in the decades-long Russian farm fox experiment begun by Dmitry Belyaev in 1959, where selecting only for calm behavior around humans produced, within a handful of generations, foxes with piebald coats, floppy ears, and curled tails, none of which anyone had bred for directly. It reflects relaxed natural selection, animals no longer needing camouflage to survive, because humans, not predators or prey, are now controlling their environment and their food. The presence of this same fingerprint in ferrets, even without a single dated genome pinpointing the moment it emerged, tells us that whatever process shaped this animal, it was long enough and thorough enough to loosen the genetic constraints that hold wild polecats to their narrow, functional coloring. The DNA cannot tell us the exact century this began. It can only tell us that by the time ferrets appear reliably in the historical and physical record, that process was already well underway. What does this mean for the ferret curled up in a hammock in someone's living room right now? It means the animal asleep in that cage or draped across a shoulder is not a simple, settled story, the way a golden retriever or a barn cat might seem to be. It is an animal whose exact wild ancestor is still debated among the researchers who study it. It is an animal whose domestication may not have followed the pattern of accidental proximity that shaped almost every other creature on this channel, but was instead a targeted response to a resource, the rabbit warren, that humans themselves had engineered and then needed a specialist tool to exploit. It is an animal connected through a shared family branch on the other side of the Atlantic to one of the narrowest brushes with true extinction in modern conservation history, saved only by a ranch dog's curiosity in the dark. The ferret carries less certainty in its genetic history than almost any other animal we have covered, and that uncertainty is not a gap waiting to be politely filled in. It is a live, unresolved question, sitting quietly in fur and bone, waiting for the kind of large-scale ancient DNA study that has already rewritten the story of the dog, the horse, and the chicken, and has not yet been done for this one. Somewhere in a Roman granary, or perhaps a medieval warren on the edge of an English field, a small, dark animal did its work in the dark, moving through tunnels no human could follow, and nobody thought to write down which animal it truly was. We do not know which wild polecat it descended from. We do not know exactly when or exactly where the first one was tamed. We do not know how many centuries of that story have already crumbled to dust in soil too acidic or bones too small for anyone to notice they were ever there. But the animal survives, curled in living rooms and hunting warrens today, carrying inside it a history that genetics has only just begun to reach far enough back to read. If you found this story remarkable, consider subscribing. There are more origins to uncover, and the DNA is only beginning to tell us what it knows.